This week's book review is Abyss, the Cuban Missile Crisis 1962 by Max Hastings. And welcome to our reviewer, Nevil Gibson. So this all happened, this crisis, 60 years ago. In fact, the year I was born. Why another book about it, and a fairly dense one at that?
Yeah, it's certainly a dense book. The 60-year, publishers love these anniversaries, and Max Hastings has written quite a number of huge war books on Stalingrad and a number of others, and he hasn't really touched on anything other than World War II, but this time he's decided to tackle the missile crisis. It was, of course, a brinkmanship. It was nuclear war. The world came very close to it. It involved the Cold War. The Americans pitched against the Russians. So there's plenty of material. Lots of memoirs have been written about it from both the Russian point of view and the American. Plus, he had access to John F. Kennedy's secret recordings in the White House. He'd just been elected president that had the Bay of Pigs. And he wanted to, he didn't tell anyone about this, and Nixon, of course, did it as well with Watergate, but he wanted to make sure that there was a record afterwards of his decisions, and mostly the book is about that decision-making.
So Hastings is known as a war historian. What was his analysis of how close the world came to nuclear war?
Well, what he looks at is that the picture in 1962 was that the Russians had a lot of nuclear weapons. They had intercontinental ballistic missiles and were the equal of the United States. But this has turned out to be not true at all. The spy, Penkovsky, a KGB agent, had alerted the Americans to the fact that there were no ICBMs in Russia at all. All they had were short-range and medium-range missiles with nuclear warheads. So putting them in Cuba was, of course, quite a tactical move by the Russians, but wasn't what the Americans were expecting. They were expecting to be bombed by rockets coming from Russia. And, of course, the public was very alarmed. There was a big anti-war movement started up, and that was what the Russians played on, Western fears of a nuclear war.
So it was a risky move. Why did Russia put them in Cuba?
Yeah, well, he goes into this in some detail because Khrushchev basically was acting out of a degree of recklessness. He didn't inform a lot of people. He had supporters, of course, in the military to do it. And Castro wasn't really told anything. And so he started unilaterally shipping both MiG jets and the nuclear warheads and the rockets to deliver them, and thinking that, the Americans won't notice. But, of course, there was a huge amount of shipping and other activity, and he'd fooled himself into thinking, according to Hastings, that Russia could stand up to the Americans as equals because if the public, Western public that is, was scared enough that they could basically do a strike first. But Khrushchev knew on his own that there was no way Russia could survive even a small first strike. Because the Americans were just so superior.
So Khrushchev did eventually back down. How does Hastings view this in light of what happened later in the Cold War?
Well, he puts all the blame on Khrushchev, and Khrushchev was telling lies because they were playing a double game, and you had Gromyko at the United Nations. And so this activity of the crisis lasted about 2 weeks in the middle of October, and there was a lot of toing and froing. The American press didn't know about the missiles. But once the Americans had confirmed there were way more missiles there than they thought, they did this with U-2 photographs and that sort of thing, Khrushchev realised the game was up, and basically he had to capitulate. He paid a price for that because he disappointed about 50,000 Russians who had moved to Cuba with all the food and everything. There's a huge amount of logistics involved, and to run all these missiles and gun emplacements, and of course the aircraft as well. So he was hated in Cuba, first of all because he had set them up for a nuclear attack potentially, because the big fear was that the Americans were going to launch an invasion, which they had plenty of plans for, but instead they decided on a blockade, and that was what squeezed the Russians too much. So the Russians backed down. Cubans were the losers because part of the deal was that America would never invade Cuba, which it hasn't, but it did maintain, of course, sanctions that made it economically very weak, and that was exacerbated after Castro fell out with the Russians, and eventually they called off their pact in 1989.
Just finally, Neville, looking back at the Cuban crisis, and you've got, Russia at war with Ukraine and threat of, more nuclear attacks and that. What relevance does it have concerning that, do you think?
I think this is part of the point that while he obviously wrote this book preceding that, it's got quite a bit. In fact, there's an entire chapter devoted to analysing the Russian thinking. They are acting in Khrushchev's day under a degree of insecurity, inferior complex. Other of us have repeated this about Putin because the Russians feel that they're surrounded by nuclear weapons, NATO, Turkey, those sort of places, and putting them in Cuba looked like a good idea at the time, but of course they can't do that now. But he doesn't draw too many conclusions about Putin acting in any kind of rational sense, but he's actually caught up in this Russian inferiority complex about the West, a hatred for the West and the fact that it was so superior. It's got all the wealth, it's got superior weapons. But
it's not exactly comforting.
No, but whether he will blink the way that Khrushchev does, we don't know. And he doesn't make a guess, but he says it doesn't look like he has got the same fear of nuclear war that Khrushchev had.
All right. Well, thanks very much for your time, Nevil Gibson.
Thank you.